You know, if you've ever read the Bible, you've probably noticed that God and Jesus go by a lot of different names. You've got Yahweh, Elohim, Adonai, Jesus, Christ. It can get a little confusing, right? It almost feels like you're trying to keep track of someone with a bunch of different aliases. But what if they're not aliases at all? What if every single name is actually a different window, showing us one more piece of a much bigger picture?
Okay, so let's start with a really common one, a question I think most of us have had at some point. Is Christ just Jesus' last name? Was his dad Joseph Christ?
Well, the short answer is a definite no. The word Christ isn't a last name, not at all. It's actually a title. It comes from the Greek word Christos, which means anointed one. So when people in the New Testament said Jesus Christ, they weren't saying Jesus from the Christ family. They were making this huge declaration: Jesus is the anointed one. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. That Greek title, Christos, wasn't pulled out of thin air. It's the word that Greek-speaking Jews used to translate a much, much older Hebrew word, Mashiach, which, of course, we know as Messiah. And guess what? They both mean the exact same thing: the one who is anointed. This isn't just a cool language fact. It is a critical, crucial link. It shows us that the very first followers of Jesus were saying, he's the one. He's the Messiah we've been waiting for, the one promised in our scriptures. See, this idea that names reveal character, that's the key to this whole explainer. And to really get what Jesus' titles mean, we've got to go back, way back, to the foundational names for God we find in the Old Testament. There are three big ones that really set the stage for everything else. And here they are, the big three. First, you have Elohim. That's God, the powerful, universal creator. Then there's YHW, or Yahweh. This is God's personal, intimate, covenant name, the great I am. And finally, Adonai, which means Lord or Master, and it speaks to his total authority. These aren't just three ways of saying the same thing. Each one shows a totally different side of his nature and how he relates to us. So the very first time God is named in the entire Bible, in Genesis 1:1, the name is Elohim. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. What's so wild about this is that in Hebrew, Elohim is a plural noun, but it's almost always used with singular verbs. Now, this isn't a hint at multiple gods. Scholars call it a plural of majesty. It's a way of saying that God's power is so vast, so immense, that a singular word just can't contain it. Okay, let's clear up another classic point of confusion. Is it Yahweh or Jehovah? So God's personal name in Hebrew is spelled with 4 letters: YHWH. Out of deep respect, ancient Jewish people avoided saying this name out loud. Instead, whenever they saw it written, they would say Adonai, meaning Lord. Fast forward many centuries, and scribes started adding vowels to the Hebrew text to make it easier to read. What they did was they took the consonants of YHWH and mashed them up with the vowels from the word they said out loud, Adonai. And that's how we got the hybrid name Jehovah. Today, most scholars agree that Yahweh is probably much closer to how the name was originally pronounced. So we've got these foundational names, but believe me, it does not stop there. The Old Testament is just packed with these amazing compound names or titles that dig even deeper, revealing specific parts of God's character, usually right when people need him the most.
Think about it like this. You can have one person, let's call her Julie, and Julie can be a doctor at work, a mother to her kids, and just Julie to her friends. It's all the same person, right? But each name or title tells you something different about her role and her relationships. It's the exact same idea here. These aren't different gods. They're different facets of the one true God being revealed through his actions. Let's look at a perfect example. Picture this. The people of Israel are in the desert. They've just escaped from Egypt, and they come to this body of water, but it's bitter. It's totally undrinkable. And they're desperate, they're complaining to Moses, and it's right in the middle of this crisis that God steps in and makes this incredible promise. And in that exact moment of need, a brand new title for God is revealed, Jehovah Rapha, which means the Lord that heals. You see the pattern? A human crisis happens, God intervenes, and a new aspect of his character gets a name. It's beautiful. And this just keeps happening over and over. When Abraham thought he would have to sacrifice his son, God showed up as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides. When Hagar was an outcast, alone in the wilderness, he was El Roi, the God who sees me. Each name is a promise born out of a real human experience.
All right, so this brings us to a huge turning point. How do all these powerful, ancient names for God connect to Jesus in the New Testament? Well, this is where we see one of the boldest, most profound theological moves in all of history.
So how did they make the connection? It happened in this kind of three-step linguistic and theological chain. Step 1, you have God's sacred Hebrew name, YHWH. Step 2, when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the translators substituted YHWH with the Greek word Curios, which means Lord. Then step 3, the very first Christians, in an absolutely decisive move, took that exact same title, Curios, and applied it directly to Jesus. Now we have to understand, this was not a casual choice. This was absolutely monumental. For a first-century Jew to call a man from Nazareth Curios, the very title their Greek scriptures use for Yahweh himself, was a staggering, earth-shattering claim. It was nothing less than a direct statement that Jesus of Nazareth was equal to the one true God of Israel. Okay, so let's bring it all home. Let's put all these pieces together and see how they create this unified portrait that all centers on the person of Jesus. We've talked about his title Christ, but what about his actual given name? The name we know as Jesus is just the English version of the Hebrew name Yeshua, and the meaning of that name is basically the entire gospel story in 2 words. Yahweh is salvation. Think about that. His very name declares his mission. He doesn't just come to talk about salvation, his name says that he is the salvation of Yahweh. And Jesus didn't just fulfill the old names and titles, he introduced a totally new one that changed everything by calling God Abba, this incredibly intimate Aramaic word that's sort of like daddy. He just shattered the formal distance. He showed that the all-powerful creator, Elohim, and the sovereign Lord Adonai could now be known and approached as a loving father. So when you put it all together, you see this incredible picture come into focus. You have the creative power of Elohim, the personal faithfulness of Yahweh, the all-sufficient provision of El Shaddai, the healing touch of Jehovah Rapha, and all of these different aspects of God's character find their ultimate, final expression in one person, Yeshua, the Savior.
And that right there is the main takeaway. All these different names for God aren't there to confuse us. They're part of a progressive revelation, a story that unfolds over thousands of years, revealing more and more and more of who God is, until it all points to and is perfectly fulfilled in one person. So this kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If every single one of these names, from creator to healer to savior to father, is a true piece of the puzzle revealing God's character, what does the whole picture, the sum total of all these names, tell us about the ultimate nature of the God they describe? That's definitely something worth thinking about.